Hey, it's Brandon Laws, your host of Transform Your Workplace. Today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. Make sure to go sign up for the annual What People Want from Work survey. This is a free employee engagement survey that you can provide to your employees to measure things like company leadership, workplace culture, training and development, compensation, and a whole lot more. We give you a free report with scores, comments, and themes that you can take back to your leadership to take real action inside your organization. A link is in the show notes to sign up. It's open through August 16th, and the survey closes August 30th. Today's guest is Rob Bier. He's the author of Smooth Scaling: 20 Rituals to Build a Friction-Free Organization. And in this conversation, Rob is sharing a lot of the most overlooked challenges of scaling a business, which is often through people. And we cover several of the 20 rituals that he covers in the book. So you definitely want to go check out the book for all of them. But we cover some ground in this conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy this. It's very actionable, and I think you're going to get a lot of insights out of how to scale your business through people. This will truly transform your workplace in a positive way. Enjoy the conversation with Rob Bier. Make sure to connect with him on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I love hearing from listeners, and thank you for all of you who have been reaching out to me about suggestions for topics and guests and other considerations. There's a lot happening in the world right now, and there's some really important things to be talking about. So I always appreciate those suggestions. Enjoy the conversation with Rob Bier. Hey, Rob, it's a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Brandon. It took a while to get us arranged, but I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and for listeners, you're in Singapore, so at the time we're recording, it's 2:30 for me, 5:30 in the morning for you, so I really appreciate you coming on to talk about your book. So
not a problem. My pleasure.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Your book is Smooth Scaling: 20 Rituals to Build a Friction-Free Organization. And so obviously in this book, you talk about the 20 rituals. We'll get into some of them. We're not going to be able to go over all of them, but you tackle the challenges that many businesses face when they're growing. The scaling is a big issue. So maybe just set this stage for us. Like what did you see within businesses that inspired you to write this book, and maybe even how you came up with the 20 rituals?
Sure. So I started working with startups about 15 years ago as an advisor, and then a bunch of my clients became scale-ups and became quite successful and quite large. And I view that as a kind of learning laboratory, because big companies have all the problems big companies have, and you can't really trace where they come from. Tiny little companies like 5-man startups don't have any of these organizational frictions. So I call that the day zero organization. Everything works, everybody's aligned, all the problems get sorted, decision-making is fast, everybody is, vibing with each other. And so somewhere along the line, things go wrong. And I've basically had a kind of a perch to see where they go wrong, what goes wrong, and to start noticing patterns. And so it just turned out that all my clients were bumping into a very similar set of issues at pretty similar stage, but they were all treating it like, oh gosh, nobody's ever seen this problem before. And I'd been working with a bunch of these companies like, hang on, I've seen this problem before. And it came at exactly the same stage. And so I just came to the conclusion that nobody has written the guidebook to these organizational frictions, as I call them, that develop as a function of scale. And I felt it was important to try and fill that gap in the knowledge marketplace, I guess.
So safe to say the rituals that you came up with were patterns and challenges you saw come up over and over again with organizations who couldn't scale. It's like, no, you do these things and then you can actually get to that next level.
Exactly. And many of them, virtually all of them apply to large companies as well. I've put them in the context of scaling companies, again, because of that oh, that's the point at which this problem first emerges. And of course, it's much easier to prevent problems or solve them early on than it is to solve them when they've been, a part of your organization for 20 years and it's part of the culture, and then it's much more difficult.
So I think a common misconception in business when we talk about scale is growing revenues and headcount is that's not scaling, right? So maybe like distinguish the difference between that side of the coin, the growing revenues and headcount versus like actual scale.
Right. Thank you. I think that's actually one of the most important starting points, because scaling has really just become the cool new word for growing. And like I like to say, back in the day, everybody used to say, agree. Shall we agree on that? And now everybody says align. Align is the cool new word for agree. And it's the same here. Scaling is just the cool new word for growing, but it is very different. Growing is revenue and inevitably means headcount. It's a very quantitative measure. Scaling is a qualitative measure. And the definition of scaling I use is that the essential qualities of the thing you are scaling remain the same as you grow them. So the simple example is, if I take a photograph and I blow it up and it's all grainy, it may be big, but it's not been scaled. But if I blow it up and it's still as fine resolution and clear as it was when it was small, that is what scaling means. And so in practice, what this means is that perfect organization you had when you were 6 or 8 people, where everybody was aligned and decisions got made really quickly and problems got sorted out and everybody knew exactly what everybody else was doing, those elements of the organization should still be as close to true as possible when you're 250. And if you don't have that, then you've grown, but you haven't scaled.
I think the challenging part of the growth and then getting to a point where you can actually scale, like what you're describing, like things can get better, performance could stay the same, is the network effect, right? Like, so as a startup, you have maybe a business partner, and then you add a friend, and then you add an outsider for the first time. And now you got 4 or 5 people. What happens when you get to 10 to 20? It gets more complex, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but you don't really notice it until the numbers get a bit bigger. It's still pretty easy to connect with 10 people or 20, to get to know them, to rub shoulders with them and build those relationships, as long as you are working at least part of the time together, physically together. I noticed that the problems of these frictions become much more pronounced much earlier in a fully remote situation where people are working only via Zoom or that sort of thing. So as long as you're working together, the problems aren't so bad when you're 10 or 20. You start to feel them more around 50, 60, and then they go completely nonlinear and crazy around 150 people. And everything that you were doing that worked pretty okay until that point stops working. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that we can get into. But yeah, the thing I notice is that these problems creep up on you and take you by surprise. So if you're a CEO or a founder, you're thinking, my organization's doing great. And then all of a sudden, 6 months later, you're like, what the heck happened?
Is it the problems they existed, or they didn't build any process or to scale, right? Like, so the issues are just bubbling up because they've always been underlying. The foundational structure was just not what it needed to be to get to that next level.
Well, that's true, but it's also true that when we spend a lot of time together, which is natural in a small organization, when we have the opportunity to build high trust, which happens naturally in a small organization, then although those problems may arise, they do get processed and dealt with. As I say, the frictions get processed and the tensions get processed. But as soon as you run one department and I run another department and we don't have the opportunity to interact, and the people who work for us only interact in what I would call more transactional settings, right? Project meetings and product reviews and that sort of thing, then all of a sudden these problems come up, the tensions come up, and they don't get resolved. And then all of a sudden they start to really manifest as dysfunction.
When you work with these organizations, maybe give me a split of the ones that are you're working on proactively, maybe at startup level where they want to get ahead of this, they want to build a foundational structure to get to scale versus those that you're going in and saying, I've seen this before. Let me show you what you need to do to fix this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Brandon. So, look, my basic lens, as you know, as you've read the book, is that the thing which mediates everything an organization does is the quality of the dialogue that we have with each other. And that if you could give everybody in an organization a magic pill that taught them the essence of really productive dialogue, then most of these problems would dissolve. And so I try to give them that magic pill very early on by teaching them some very basic rituals about how to have effective dialogue, starting with listening, right? And when you set those foundations and make them strong, other people who get hired into the organization naturally mimic the founders. It's quite natural to do so, and you can start to create a foundational culture, which is a stronger and more resilient culture in which people don't, for example, jump to conclusions when they hear something that they don't like, but instead learn to ask questions and be curious and say, where are you coming from on that? And how did you reach that conclusion? And that can spread and create a much stronger foundation.
Mm-hmm. You know what's like interesting in reading your book and just what I think about scale? My brain always goes to technology, workflows, automation, and that's what builds scale. And I think that is true, but I think like the bulk of your work in this book is around the people and the culture and people working together because people are messy and complicated. Is that what you found is getting to scale is more of a human problem than it is like building out process and automation and things like that?
It clearly requires both.
Yeah.
And I'm simply not an expert in the process and automation piece. But I do like to run a thought experiment. So here's the thought experiment. Imagine that you were suddenly brought in to be the CEO of a company of 150 people. You were brought in from the outside, and I'll give you two versions. One company has brilliant processes and great technology and really good workflow, but absolutely terrible dialogue, political factions, mistrust, miscommunication, people who almost refuse to work with each other, really poor dialogue. And another one, which is the reverse, it has almost no process or technology, but has perfect dialogue. Anytime a problem comes up, the relevant people get together, they work it out in a really constructive way. Which company do you think is going to do better?
One who has productive dialogue.
Yeah, and you know why? Because the first thing they're going to do is they're going to say, we need to build some processes. And they'll figure out what are the right processes, and they'll figure out what is the right technology. And if it's not perfect, they'll tweak it because they have the ability to reflect and problem solve and give feedback and learn from each other. Whereas the first one, those systems will rapidly become useless as the needs of the organization change and the company is unable to adapt. So I do think that dialogue is the foundation, and it doesn't replace, of course, the need for technology and process. But I think that it is the upstream thing. Your strategy came out of a dialogue. Your technology came out of a dialogue. The people you hired came out of a dialogue. And if you improve the quality of dialogue, you improve all those downstream decisions and products and plans and tools that you build.
Earlier, you talked about how I think you mentioned it, that remote work has really made the dialogue a little bit more challenging. I mean, I've felt it myself. I think when, especially as people rely on like technology and communication tools and they're not using them properly, I think that's creating friction in a large respect and is supposed to actually create fluidity within dialogue. Maybe unpack that a little bit. Why do you think remote work, hybrid work has damaged this area a little bit?
Right. Well, let me start with the tools. Because again, another way of answering your previous question is if technology solved the problem, then no company would have any problems because they all have lots of technology, right? Everybody's using Slack and all these modern collaborative tools and SaaS software and so on. Look, the reason remote work makes it much more difficult, I think, is well known. Human beings build trust in a very interesting way, which we can dive into, which I've become, I think, kind of an expert in. But building trust doesn't happen just naturally. And it doesn't happen only by talking about work problems. And the technological interface reduces the way we talk to each other to a very transactional kind of conversation, and the Slack and messaging tools in particular. And so those tools are super powerful for transactional type of work. What time are you going to do that call? And shall we launch on a Tuesday or a Thursday? And what's the, but it's not very good for building relationships. It's not very good for deepening trust, and it's not very good for solving problems. And in particular, when you look at the world of problems, there are two kinds of problems, two kinds of conversations, what I call it conversations, projects and code and milestones and budgets and customers, right? All the stuff of business. And then us conversations, feedback and how are we working together? And I didn't appreciate the way that you hung me out to dry in front of the boss, and all of those conversations. Those conversations require trust, the us conversations. They're also the conversations that build trust. And we tend to have those conversations only in person, often over a beer or a cup of coffee outside the office. And when you remove the opportunity to have those us conversations and everything becomes more transactional, then it's much easier for problems to take hold and never get resolved.
With the time that we have left, I want to get into some of the rituals. I'm not going to go over all of them, of course, so we don't have enough time for that. And I, of course, want to point people to the book. So I'm going to pick a few that that stuck out to me and I think are important. So let's start with ritual number one, thinking together. You'd mentioned that thinking together ritual might feel a little slow or awkward at first, but it can transform a company over time. Maybe elaborate on what is that ritual, what does it entail, and what you've observed in companies that have adopted this.
Yeah. Thinking together, I'm so glad you started that. That is the most profound one. And it is the art of learning to listen in a really high quality way. It actually goes beyond active listening. It's a form of listening. And this work was developed originally by a woman named Nancy Klein. If you want to go deep, you can read her book, Time to Think. It's listening in a way that helps you to do your very best thinking. Now, people kind of think, what do we mean by that? Well, if every time you start talking, I make a face like, no, that's not right, and I look like I'm about to interrupt, and then I do interrupt, that puts you off, right? You're not able to do your best thinking, and you become defensive. And when I listen with genuine curiosity and space, your mind not only does a good job of communicating what you already think, but it's continuing to think in real time. And the dynamic between us is helping you to get to new ideas, new thoughts, and you're also hearing me in that same way. And what that leads to is when you and I get together, two things happen. We learn from each other, and we've developed ideas and solutions that are better than yours and better than mine. Now, that has a profound impact. One, it's joyful when I work with you and we learn from each other and we come up with ideas and solutions that are better than yours and better than mine. I'm like, I love working with that Brandon guy. It's so fun. The other thing is we come up with better ideas and solutions. So it's great for the business. We're moving the ball forward and we're doing it in a way that makes us really want to work with that person some more. And many people are able to do this naturally with one other person, but they don't know what they're doing or how they're doing it. And so I'm teaching you something which you kind of are already doing, but I'm making it explicit so that you can do it with 3 and 6 and on a Zoom call and so on. So the kernel is how do we converse with each other in a way where we learn, where we come up with ideas and solutions that are better than yours and better than mine, to create both that productivity, as I call it, the great new ideas, and the positivity of the pleasure of working with that person.
Not that I'm going to go one by one on all these rituals, but ritual number 2, I think, is an important one. Share your personal user guide. What I think often people get wrong in the beginning of a relationship is not creating agreements with each other and not understanding how to work with one another. And I think that's what's covered in this personal user guide. So maybe talk through how that looks, and is it complicated to do? Is it
Right.
simple form? Like maybe just share.
It's super simple and it's absolutely essential to scaling. One of the most important rituals. A couple of things. If we are a small group of 5 people, we will learn how to work well with each other just naturally, particularly if we are working in person and we're having those us conversations. The personal user guide, again, just makes explicit something that happens naturally and implicitly in very small groups. It says, hey, we need to start having those us conversations before there are problems. Because once there are problems, it's really hard and awkward. So tell me about yourself. How do you work? What are you good at? What are your strengths? By the way, I'm going to share some of my vulnerabilities. I know I'm not perfect. I have self-awareness about that. Maybe you'll share a little bit about that too. Now we're having those open, vulnerable, high trust conversations before there are any problems, so that when problems come up, we feel much more comfortable and we're much more likely to surface those problems and work through them. And so the personal user guide is really a way of role modeling that it is safe between us to have more vulnerable conversations, including those essential us conversations, and to do it in a way that scales. Because if our team has 4 new people next week, because our company is growing quickly, we're going to skip all that. We're just going to dive in and get to work, and then problems are going to come up. We're going to be like, oh, geez, I can't work with that guy. He's a real problem. He doesn't get it, blah, blah, blah. But if you start on onboarding day by sharing your personal user guide, it's absolutely transformational. And I've seen that many times in many of the companies I've worked with. And it scales.
People around me know I'm not a huge fan of meetings, especially ones that are not good. And in ritual number 8, you talk about deep dive meetings being crucial for high performing teams. So what are those key elements of a deep dive meeting that make it so effective that you got to convince me here?
Look, I'm actually with you, Brandon. Bad meetings are the death of any organization. But great meetings are the lifeblood of any organization. And so I always ask people to think about a day where maybe they had a couple of meetings that were absolutely great. Now, what is a great meeting? Let's talk about what a great meeting is. A great meeting is one where we're working on our most important issues, because if you go into a meeting and it's all about compliance and filling in your bureaucratic forms on time, of course, like, they're not going to get much energy out of that. But if you go in and something's really been bothering you about the way your company is working, and you have this feeling that maybe it could be done better, and somebody says, that's what we're going to talk about today, you're like, yeah, I want to talk about that. I want to make the company better. Most people want to make their companies better. So if we're talking about an issue that's really important and that will make the company more successful, people are excited. And if we can hold that meeting in a way which meets 2 simple characteristics, then people will come out totally pumped and energized. 1, we actually make progress on that issue, right? And we harness that collective thinking so that we understand Brandon's perspective and the compliance person's perspective and the finance person's perspective and the CEO's perspective. And we come up with ideas and solutions on how to make that one thing better. And everybody's like, yeah, I think that could work. That sounds good. Let's try it, right? That's exciting and that's energized. And so I just call that productivity. We move the ball forward on an important issue in a way that harnessed the collective intelligence. The second question is, how did that meeting make me feel? Did I feel included? Was I able to contribute? Did I get shut down every time I opened my mouth, or ignored or talked over? Or did people really listen and say, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. So if I feel good because my contribution felt like it landed and like people were interested in my point of view, even if I didn't get my way, that's not what makes meetings satisfying to people. But if I know that my voice was heard and we moved the ball forward on an important issue, I'm going to come out of that meeting totally energized. And I want you to now do a crazy thought experiment. Imagine that you went into the office one day in person, and first you had an informal meeting with a peer, just chatting about some issues, and the meeting went really great. You came up with new ideas. You thought, yeah, I like working with that person. And then you had a meeting with your boss, and the same. And then you had a team meeting, great meeting. And then you had a cross-functional meeting, great meeting. You'd go home and you'd say to your partner, honey, I had an amazing day at the office today. And now I want you to think of something even wilder, which is, what if that was true every time you went into the office? You'd say, honey, I love my job. So I do think that the best meetings are transformational. And the problem is not that we have too many, but that they're just lousy.
I agree. Cross-functional work is tough, especially in larger organizations. Ritual number 11 is set up cross-functional work for success. How do we do that?
It turns out when you look at why silos develop and why cross-functional projects are usually a bit of a train wreck, that there are some very simple reasons. And a lot of them have to do with what I would just call information asymmetry. If I'm in my department, I know what our priorities are. I know what our constraints are. We have a common language system. In your department, I don't know any of that stuff. And so we dive in, we start saying, okay, let's work on this project. The boss wants us to get this out really quick. Let's dive in. And we simply don't take the time to understand each other's world a little bit. Setting up for success recognizes that maybe this project, which is number 1 for me, and I have plenty of capacity in my department to work on it, is number 4 for you, and you have very little capacity to work on it. Now, setting up for success doesn't immediately resolve that problem, but it identifies the potential friction points and it highlights them so that we can manage around them rather than running into them and smacking them having them smack us in the face. So it's just really a way of getting aligned in terms not only of the problem we're trying to solve, but the context from which our different departments come from.
I'm going to skip all the way to ritual number 20, run an information marketplace. What's this one?
This is one of the most fun. So if you've ever been, let's say, in the HR department of a company, people will come and say, I just never know what's going on in my company. We need to hear more about what's going on. How come nobody talks to us about anything? And then somebody says, right, we're going to do a newsletter. We're going to have an intranet. And nobody looks at it. And you think, this is so frustrating. We put all this energy into tell you everything that's going on, and you didn't even bother to read the email. And so this is a way of resolving that dilemma. People want to know what they want to know, and it has to be demand-led. If you force feed them information about everything that's going on in the organization, they just won't digest it. But if you don't give them a way of finding out what's going on, then they get very frustrated. And so the information marketplace is literally a marketplace. It's like setting up a big trading hall, like the, Seattle Fish Market. Picture that, right? Pike's Place or whatever it's called. And you can go in and you can go to the salmon booth and say, hey, how's the salmon this week? Or you can go to the oyster booth and say, you got any oysters? And so you set up a few booths virtually or in person of different departments, maybe new projects, things that people might be curious about, and you give them a chance to interact just like they would in a Pike's Place market and say, hey, what's going on with your project? How come we're doing that? Tell me more. Oh, that's interesting. And so it's just a very lively and fun way for different parts of the organization to connect with each other for the express purpose of finding out what's really going on. What are you trying to do? And how are you guys going about it? And then they start noticing that people say, hey, now that I know what you're doing, how can I help? Call me anytime. And it makes these really, really fun and strong connections across the organization that would never have existed otherwise. So yeah, just picture a big open marketplace with everybody kind of going around and exploring and tasting different products.
Yeah, I love that. I think the information overload is real. I know in my organization, we try our hardest to be open and transparent about what's going on, make sure people feel included and belonged inside the organization. But it's like we hit them up through email and through newsletters and social media and like all these different places. And it's overwhelming because at some point you do tune it out because there's only so much attention that you can have towards this information. So I like the idea of a marketplace. What kind of platforms or format have you seen organizations do? I don't know if you have a certain technology that you like for this, but
Oh, actually, Zoom works great, or Teams. It's just breakout rooms. So you just publish a thing that says between 10 and 10:25, we'll have 4 breakout rooms. This new project, a team that's got a new leader who wants to describe his vision, and maybe a third and a fourth one. And then people choose. And because they're choosing, they're really listening because they chose it, right? They're curious not about oysters today because they don't like oysters, but they're curious about the salmon. So they go to the salmon guy. They say, what's going on with salmon? And so you're in a room. It might be, 10 or 30 people. And the guy who's running that new project that nobody really understands talks for 5-10 minutes. And then there's 10-15 minutes of Q&A. It's very intimate. And then everybody pops out of their breakout room, takes a 5-minute bio break, and then they get to go again. And maybe you do that 3 times. And so people won't experience everything that's going on, but they'll choose what they want to learn about. And that's the thing that really cracks the code, because when the people choose, then they're really listening and engaged.
So, Rob, we went through a few of the rituals. There's 20 of them. I encourage people to go check out the book. But let's say somebody listening, they go get the book, they recognize the flaws that they have in their organization, they choose the rituals or do all of them. I don't know what you suggest, but they do them. How can we measure the change that may have happened by implementing these rituals inside our organization?
Yeah, great question. Let's take a step back. Why are so many organizations so messed up internally? And why are the top leaders typically so focused on external solutions, entering new markets and launching new products and growing revenues, and often paying relatively little attention to these internal problems and frictions? I believe that the main reason is because there's been no good way to measure the effectiveness of the organization. And as the great Peter Drucker said, what gets measured gets managed, and no wiser words were ever said. So imagine if you walked in and there was a big dial in the front of your building that said sales and another big dial that said organizational health. And everybody's looking at that dial. Then executives would be like, oh my God, organizational health is taking a dip. I'm going to get grief from the board. We better dive in and figure out what's going on. So having a way of measuring is essential. And it has been basically impossible. It is not your employee engagement survey. Asking people how happy they are and finding out that they'd like a better benefits package is all to the good, but that is not what we're talking about. That is not measuring the health of your organization. And your business results are a byproduct of the health of your organization, but it's a very lagging indicator, and it doesn't tell you where things are going. There is a whole suite of new tools coming out, which are AI-based, which are leveraging generative AI, and they are passively observing what's going on. Yeah, they are reading your emails, they're listening to your Zoom calls, but by the way, so are all those AI tools that we're already using that summarize our meetings and so on. And they're noticing where are decisions getting made and where decisions not getting made. Where is there swirl? Where is there conflict? Where is there a drop in communication where there had been active communication? And they're getting very smart very quickly on picking up on many of the indicators of organizational health. And they will do 2 things. They will provide coaching, and they will also provide aggregate health scores to top management. And so the short answer is we've not had a way to manage organizational health, and that's why it's gone unmanaged to measure it. And we're going to have these tools. So I'm working with a very interesting company in the UK called Waggle. And if you Google Waggle AI, you'll find it. You might want to interview the CEO, who's a delightful woman. And we're building a tool that will measure your organizational health, give constructive coaching at the individual and team level, and give some aggregate scorecards to the top management that'll give them real insight.
That sounds amazing, because as you're talking, I'm like, how do you measure this? And you're right. I don't think people have been able to effectively do this, but the AI tools, because they're working when we're sleeping and reading everything, and they can process so much data, it is possible. Maybe you can give me an introduction to that person. I would love to interview her. I think that'd be a good part 2 to this conversation. Rob, your book is Smooth Scaling 20 Rituals to Build a Friction-Free Organization. Just a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on. Any like parting thoughts, or do you want to point people to any of your other work that you're doing?
Well, they can check out more about me at robbier.com if they want to know more. I would definitely encourage them, of course, to buy the book. And then I would just say one thing: pay attention for one day to the quality of the conversations that you have in all your interactions, one-on-ones, big team meetings, cross-functional meetings, and notice that when those conversations are great, you go home energized, thinking we're really moving the ball forward and I love the process. And that when those conversations are awful, you go home frustrated, thinking maybe I need a new job or need a new boss. And see if you don't come to the same conclusion that I did, which is that the quality of dialogue really is the root cause of many of the both best parts of our organization and worst parts.
Well said, Rob. My guest today has been Rob Bier, the author of Smooth Scaling 20 Rituals to Build a Friction-Free Organization. Rob, thanks for being part of the podcast.
Brandon, it's been a real pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.